Moratti, and I'm very happy to welcome you in the third online lecture of our project, Centre. As you maybe know, some of you have already been in this series of lectures and discussion panels. Centre is a project that promotes bilateral activities between Iceland, Greece, and Norway by creating a digital hub devoted to gender perspectives of COVID-19 and its aftermath. In this hub, in our activities, we deal with 5 different issues connected with gender and COVID-19. The first is on care and labor, gender, care and labor. The second is on gender-based violence. And the third that we initiate today is on women and gender in science. Before we start our lecture by Sofia Moratti from Norway, we have the pleasure to have with us the ambassador of Norway in Greece, Mr. Frode Overland Andersen, who is going to address the meeting and welcome you also to our Centre project. His Excellency Frode Overland Andersen, please take the floor.
Thank you so much, Professor Stratigaki. It's indeed a great honor for me to address you tonight. On behalf of the donor countries, Norway, Liechtenstein, and Iceland, I'm delighted to be here for this online lecture dedicated to women in science during the pandemics. A particularly warm welcome for today's guest speaker, Sofia Moratti, and her team from the Norwegian University of Science and Technology, the NTNU. As we just discussed before we started, I am an alumni of NTNU myself, and it's indeed a great personal pleasure to welcome this distinguished university into Greece and into this cooperation. Let me also take this opportunity to commend the work of the Center of Gender Studies of the Panteion University of Athens, under the guidance of you, Professor Maria Stratigaki, for advancing this project under the difficult circumstances of the pandemic. We had hoped that we can see each other more in person, and we have been looking forward to that. But as we have discovered during the year, online is the best we can do. And I think with the good ratings and the good viewers you have had for these lectures, I think it's proved that it's possible to actually do a lot of good work online as well. And we are looking forward to learning more through the researchers, journalists, and gender equality professionals who will take part in these workshops and the workshops to come. I think the pandemic has certainly raised new and interesting perspective when it comes to studies of gender. And just to take a very homely example, I see it's being written in the papers and it's probably experienced by several that many couples during the pandemic sitting in their home office around the kitchen table has discovered that, well, indeed, we thought we had equality, that we were distributing the tasks in our house at a generally equal way. But it's not the case, is it? As we have discovered, many of us. Well, I'm a Norwegian male. I thought I did pretty well. Doing home office for a year, I see that I'm not as good as I thought I was. So this is a very, very earthly, down-to-earth, basic example. I'm sure Mrs. Moratti will have much better examples than I have. So I will not keep her from you longer. I will just say thank you very much to everyone for supporting these projects. Thank you everyone for participating, and good luck with tonight's lecture.
Thank you, Ambassador.
Yes.
We are very lucky really to have Norway as a partner in this project, because the gender equality issues and the gender equality performance in your country is much better than ours. So it is an opportunity for us to learn from you, but I hope you learn also from us how difficult things are. So really for this project on gender equality, to have Norway and Iceland as partners is the best we could have, and thanks to EA funds grants we have this possibility to work together. So thank you for your support to our project, and we hope really to see you in person before the end of the project. Fortunately, it will last till mid 2022, so we have some chance to meet you. Great. Thank you very much. So I give the floor now to Siri Sorensen from the Norwegian University of Science and Technology at Trondheim. Siri is one of very close collaborators in this project, representing the Center for Gender Research in this university. And now Siri is going to present our speaker of today, Sofia Moratti. Please, Siri.
Thank you, Maria. Yes, so I'm the head of Center for Gender Research at NTNU, and we are very proud to be partners in the ProGender project. And I'm also very proud to introduce one of my brilliant colleagues to you, Dr. Sofia Moratti. She's a senior researcher at the Center for Gender Research at NTNU. And she's involved in research on gender in academia as work package leader in the on strategies and policies of university top level government. So this is also her expertise. She has her educational background from Italy, Netherlands, and now currently working in Norway. So you'll have the lecture from one of our prominent scholars in the field. So I give the floor to you, Sofia, please.
Thanks a lot, Siri. Okay, can you see my slides now?
Yes, great. Full
Thanks
screen.
Thanks everyone for the introduction. Many thanks, Siri. I thanked you before and then I realized I did not unmute. You made me too emotional. It's kind of introduction. But anyway, I'm really very happy to be here today. Many thanks for your invitation. And I'm particularly delighted to be able to discuss an interesting topic such as women scientists during the pandemic as part of this very interesting pro-gender hub on gender, the COVID-19 crisis and its aftermath. Women have been historically excluded from science careers. Just to give an example, this is the Solvay conference in physics in 1927, and it made history. It's a famous picture, and the only woman in attendance was Marie Curie. You can see her sitting in the front row next to Max Planck, and Albert Einstein is at the center of that row. So women as a gender went from exclusion to marginalization to increasing inclusion in science career, but we are still far from having achieved equality. And there are multiple streams of empirical literature that investigate this question. There is literature in education science and in psychology and in gender studies as well that focused on gendered upbringing and gendered education and bias against girls that started at a very early age, even by teachers and peers. There is evidence that teachers and peers and even families tend to underestimate women's abilities in traditionally men-dominated domains, such as the hard sciences. For example, one of the papers I refer to here turns out that when science, schoolwork, or tests performed at school are anonymous, teachers systematically tend to grade girls better than they do when they see the name of the female student, when they see that the author of the test is a female. This is in secondary school, study carried out in secondary school. Girls and women internalize the bias and end up perceiving themselves as having lower abilities. Gendered education can start as early as kindergarten with gender-specific toys, as for example, boys get the little scientist kit and girls get the little top model kit. So this self-image as less than or not suited for can persist into adulthood and influence education and career choices and professional behavior and performance. And this has also been proven. Another stream of literature, mainly in sociology and in gender studies, focus on motherhood and childcare as factors that trigger discrimination against women, and as more time-consuming and more career disrupting for women than for men, because such tasks fall disproportionately on women. There is also extensive literature in psychology, sociology, and gender studies on gender bias in professional evaluation. Well-known studies where identical fictional CVs were rated differently depending on whether the name of the candidate sounded male or female. Fictional candidates, fictional CVs, and the names were assigned arbitrarily by the researchers. Men, or better, CVs with the name of fictional men on them, were systematically better evaluated. They were deemed more employable. And also identical abstracts of articles.
You made me too emotional.
I can hear someone speaking in the background. And also identical abstracts of. I think there is a malfunctioning with sounds. I can hear some noise in the background, but I will continue. A similar study was performed with identical abstract of fictional articles and different names on the article, male or female name, and the male fictional authors were rated better and deemed more interesting for collaboration. But again, the abstracts were identical, exactly like the CVs in the other study were identical. So it was just about whether the author was believed to be male or female. Bias in recommendation letters has also been extensively proven. The length, meaning recommendation letters for science posts in academia for men, turned out to be systematically longer, worded differently. Men were more often described as talented, and women more often described as hardworking, for example. These are large-scale studies on thousands of recommendation letters for academic science posts in the US. And also bias in recognition from group work has also been empirically proven. Another issue that is very interesting is the so-called paradox of meritocracy in organization. When the science organization, its corporate philosophy, its leadership strongly emphasizes meritocracy, managers may display greater bias against women when they translate employee performance evaluation into concrete rewards, such as career advancement or pay rise. So meritocracy sometimes serves as a mere smoke screen. This is a very original study on gender bias. Then there are multiple studies on pay gap. Evidence that women are less paid when qualifications and responsibilities are equal. This is a whole line of investigation, mainly in economics. There is also evidence of gender differences in accepting and receiving requests for tasks with low promotability. So not just receiving such requests, but also how inclined the person is to accept those requests. This is an interesting combination then of a study of the role of gendered assumptions and pressure by others on the one hand, and gendered self-image on the other hand, that sort of prompts the person to behave differently, to be less resistant against requests of carrying out tasks that have lower promotability. Then after the Me Too movement, especially after the Me Too movement, a whole line of research developed on sex harassment. Phenomenon is now luckily receiving more attention also by researchers and also in science organizations and in academia, for example. So this is not a comprehensive list. Okay, this short review is just by way of introduction. It's not comprehensive. This being the background of literature, what can happen further under a pandemic? Okay, more importantly, what are the issues in focus? Since there are so much we could research, there are so many directions we could take when we investigate the gender gap in science. What is assumed to be the problem when interrogating gender inequality in science during the pandemic? Which questions are scholars asking in their peer-reviewed empirical studies that discuss women scientists under the pandemic? I found this question extremely interesting. Which assumptions are made on scientific labor and gender in the empirical literature on the gendered impact of COVID-19 on scientific labor? My goal here is interrogating conceptualizations rather than discussing findings. As you can imagine, the findings almost exclusively show multiple patterns of disadvantage. So what is taken to symbolize, to be the ultimate evidence of the gender gap in scientific work? I carried out a systematic literature review using Google Scholar. And this I did in March 2021, so after over a year into the pandemic in the West. So I entered the strings women scientists pandemic. I gave no time frame, but I obviously got very recent results anyway, because the pandemic is something recent. I ordered results by relevance. I retained only empirical studies that have a focus on women scientists and on women in science careers. And I ignored not relevant papers, like papers on, for example, medications to treat COVID and differential effect depending on the gender of the person who receives it. I browsed the first 11 pages, so that's 110 entries. And already toward page 7, I found no more relevant entries. So I guess I had reached saturation. And then I repeated the process using women scientists COVID as a string. And I transposed my findings, there's a list of papers with full reference, into a Word file, and I color-coded them. These are raw data, so it's a small picture. You can't see the content, but it's just to give you an idea of what this talk is based on, how I organized the empirical material for this talk. So, I discovered that when it comes to the question asked, all the relevant empirical papers were published in the past year fall into one or both of these groups. Either they seek to measure the scholarly productivity of women under the pandemic and the gap with men, of course, or they seek to investigate the impact of childcare and secondarily of domestic labor on women's professional lives and opportunities during the pandemic, or they seek to investigate the impact of childcare specifically on scholarly productivity. So they fall in both groups. There are some other issues raised in some of the papers, but they are not as central, those issues, as scholarly productivity and childcare. And I found another 20 papers that were non-empirical, such as commentaries, recommendations, call for actions, more generic. But when it comes to looking for an indicator that symbolizes gender inequality, it was all about scholarly productivity or childcare and domestic labor. The most frequently asked question in empirical research on the impact of COVID-19 of women scientists is: how was their productivity affected, identified with peer-reviewed scholarly papers as an output? Okay, with very little problematization. Productivity in science equals peer-reviewed scholarly papers. So a fitting metaphor here, and that's why I'm giving you that image, is the science machine, the scholarship machine. You get an input, you give an input to the machine of time and energy and money, and you get the output that is a peer-review publication. The higher rated, the better. And incidentally, as you can see from the tweet on the right of this slide, the scientific community, or at least some scientists on social media, demonstrated awareness of this kind of pressure to use the lockdown. This tweet is from the early phases of lockdown, this pressure to use the lockdown as a productivity opportunity, as a writing opportunity. More specifically, the studies in my sample investigated submission rates by gender or perception of one's own productivity, for example, through surveys among scientists. I saw no discussion of the content or of the quality of the papers that had been submitted or the studies that were described in the papers. And the findings, as you can imagine, is that with the pandemic, there was a lower share of women authors and especially corresponding authors in submission. And this was measured in multiple ways, in different studies. And the gender-specific disadvantage also when it comes to scientists' own perception of their research productivity. There's one exception, but that's a study that looks at one journal only. So one journal only, I mean, that's not enough. In one study, productivity was identified with clinical trial leadership, which again, however, is likely to lead to a prestigious place in the authorship of the paper that will then be published. Why is productivity unproblematically identified with peer-reviewed papers interpreted as an output? Why is that happening? Well, of course, it's a key metric with material consequences for individuals in terms of promotion, salary decision, career, and for science organizations and institutions in terms of funding, prestige, ranking, for example. And this is one explanation. Another explanation is, well, for practical reasons. Publicly accessible quantitative data, such as data on publication, are easy to use, easy to access and easy to use for comparison and for ranking. And this is the so-called metricization of scientific work. These two factors, by the way, may be linked with one another in the sense that the more value, the more importance is placed on one particular type of output, the more efforts will be made to translate that output into simple indicators that make it measurable and easy to evaluate and easy to assess for ranking purposes. And the more central that output will become in evaluations and assessment precisely because it's so easy to quantify. But publication-based metrics are only proxies for publication quality. And so all the scholars and the scientists in my public will certainly know that the only way to know the quality of a paper is to read it, right? I mean, you have certainly a direct experience where you read a certain paper that was maybe in a highly ranked journal and it disappointed you, or you read a paper that didn't look like a top-notch publication, and when it comes to the content, it definitely was. So I really like this book by Müller. It's called The Tyranny of Metrics. And this is a quote: "Not everything that can be counted counts, and metric fixation, which aspires to imitate science, too often resembles faith." The centrality of publication output to science careers has been described as fetishization of publication. Publishing is not the ultimate aim of scientific work, yet it's the key symbol of gender inequalities in science also during the pandemic. And this could further reinforce the devaluing of other types of work in science organizations. So collegial aspects, right? The training, the mentoring of more junior colleagues, collaboration, peer review, all those aspects that are harder to quantify. And more importantly, it could also signal that a constant output is assumed to be the default mode, even in the middle of a nearly unprecedented global health crisis. So are we here pursuing excellence or are we normalizing overwork? I want to give you a title of one of the papers in my sample that is "No Tickets for Women in the COVID-19 Race." It was a race. And this, I think, is either the title or in the abstract: "Pandemic Penalty for Women." Race, penalty, these are words that come from competitive sports. So what does that say about the underlying mentality. This is a very famous still from Charlie Chaplin's classic Modern Times, movie from 1936. So Chaplin is a worker, he's part of an assembly line, he's merely one wheel in a much larger mechanism. And this is from the same movie. The worker has no lunch break. The feeding is part of the assembly line because the production machine must not be disrupted by care needs such as feeding. There is an interesting concept in sociology, reproductive labor, that is also very dear to feminists and to gender scholars. Reproductive labor means work that is aimed at recreating the capacity to work, recreating the worker by taking care of the worker or of the worker's living environment and dependence. For example, cooking, housekeeping, childcare, that's reproductive labor. Reproductive labor is often unpaid, but it is labor, it is work. There has historically been a clear gender division of labor between men and women. Women have traditionally been confined to reproductive labor, and the gender disparities that are the consequence of that history are still visible today. So the second group of papers in my sample investigate the impact of childcare and secondarily of domestic labor on women scientists during the pandemic. And often the impact of childcare is quantified again in terms of publication output. So there's an interesting question with school and daycare closure and home office that has led to more time in the home for the entire family. However, it is also interesting to notice that women's scholarly productivity seems to be primarily analyzed in relation to different kinds of productivity, okay? The assumption that disruption to scholarly productivity may arise to some other forms of measurable productivity. This is a sign that labor-intensive, again, highly productive work is assumed to be the norm in science, no matter the circumstances, and that deviations from that norm need to be explained, or maybe to use a stronger word, even justified with other types of labor, other types of measurable productivity, and different justifications are somehow less legitimate, less acceptable. Is that what it implies? As it seems to me, possibly. But our analysis of gender and work in science, are we accommodating factors, more factors rather than fixating on different forms of measurable productivity that compete with one another? For example, what is the role of taken for granted, received ideals? The Draw a Scientist test was developed by Chambers in 1983 to investigate children's imaginaries of the scientist. The children typically drew a man, and the man with specific stereotypical features too. Chambers successfully showed that the ideal scientist is not disembodied. Apparently, this is changing in recent years as our imagery as a society is changing as women enter the workforce in large numbers. So children draw more women scientists, but for a long time, the ideal scientist has been drawn like this image that I'm showing you. So I think we need to devote attention to cultural representation, to the cultural representations that linger in the background of the practices and cultures of science organizations, and that can run counter to the principle of careers open to talents and universalism in who gets to participate. Scientific research, this is a quote from Roth and Sonner, presents a paradox to the sociological observer, because at the epistemological level, science is a driving force towards dispelling prejudice and preconception. But scientific research at the level of social organization sometimes cannot keep up with that ideal. Gender success models that are presented as objective and gender neutral and achievable by anyone through effort have been exposed as gendered. Success models in science are shaped around men because men have dominated science for centuries. Women have been historically marginalized for failing to live up to the benchmark man. As Margaret Thornton says, the benchmark man is the invariable term of comparison in discrimination complaints. Paradigmatic examples of such gender success models, for example, in academic science, are the ideal academic, theorized by Rebecca Lund, based on the classic theorization of the ideal worker by Joan Ecker, and the technopreneur by Margaret Thornton, a scientific researcher with business acumen that produces academic capitalism. When we assume that gender inequality in science is the consequence of childcare, for example, we implicitly or more or less explicitly create two imageries, two ideals: the unconstrained man with high productivity as opposed to the interrupted woman with low productivity. That may in itself reinforce gendered assumptions. I mean, one thing is the analysis of women's experiences, and another is the analysis of mothers or carers' experiences. Okay, only some women will be mothers or carers. If we conflate these two dimensions, we are imagining women by default as primarily carers. I mean, even for scientists who are mothers and carers, their professional disadvantage may not be the consequence of their care obligations. For example, there may be here a clash, as I see it, between competing cultural representations, the ideal mother and the ideal worker, both demanding total and exclusive dedication. Also, this binary representation poses heterosexual marriage as the norm. It assumes one specific particular type of family structure. People do not necessarily identify as either men or women. You know, they don't necessarily fit a binary gender identity. They do not necessarily live in heterosexual households with two adults. And not in every household there is unequal division of childcare labor, for example. There are men scientists who are fathers, there are people who are single, and different generations that may live together. So it's more complicated than it seems. Also, it could be we reinforce one other important gendered assumption as a kind of sexist ideal of masculinity in science as being centered on competition, competitiveness. And this is a cliche. It's a generalization in itself. It's not an accurate portrayal. We should not think that that is necessarily the default form of masculinity in science. Another problematic aspect of this opposition between unconstrained men and interrupted women is that it leads us to neglecting important intraprofessional factors. For example, the work task allocations across genders. The phrase academic housework, have you ever heard it used? Or departmental housekeeping for academic science, again, task with lower promotability. This is a very important aspect to research. And the importance of job security and the effect that it may have on work dynamics. That's something that was very much neglected in the papers in my sample, for example. Especially in times of increasing precarization, that's a central aspect to investigate. In conclusion, I believe that to better understand the situation of women scientists during the pandemic, and particularly from the perspective of gender scholars, it is very important to have more research on aspects of work that do not necessarily lead to easily measurable and countable outputs, to reflect more on how we can do research on that, even though it may not be as immediately practical as counting publications. and to reflect on intra-professional factors, supports by colleagues, sex harassment also, which I mentioned in the beginning, or work allocation. That's also very important to research. Again, not easily measurable, not easily countable. Cultural representation of science worker are a key component here, and symbols of achievement, what symbolizes success, achievement in science, what is assumed to symbolize success and achievement. As I said, job security must always be there in our research, particularly of academic science, but also increasingly of science outside of academia, in the gendering of science career. And we need to, while childcare is an important component of gender difference in science, we need to move beyond the childcare-centered analysis and to move beyond the heteronormative family model. So this should be part of our research, but shouldn't necessarily be constantly posed as the central question. Thank you for your attention, and questions welcome. Here are
Thank
some.
you, Sofia. Thank you,
papers I
Sofia.
used.
Thank you very much for really, you covered everything on the issue gender in research. Really, you remind me a lot of the literature and the problematic, let's say, the questions we raised in the 80s, because I think that, I mean, all these questions about norms, about types of representations and all these things are really, they started to be expressed at least already some years ago. And for instance, the question of the feminist methodology, the feminist methodology has questioned the metrics and the measure and the quantitative versus the qualitative. I remembered also the very good example of the biologist McClintock about how to think so that you discover things in a different way, let's say. And about the typical scientist who is a man, and not only as a body, but also as a way of everyday life, family structure, and all these things. So thank you very much. It was really very, very interesting. One of our participants here, I think she's a student in our university. She highlighted the question of Greek language that does not have the word scientist in female form. In Greece, we have female and male forms for a lot of words, much more than in English. So for the word scientist, we don't have one, and we have to invent one. And also this is an additional effort for inventing, let's say, and trying to use in a whole, let's say, for everybody, trying to use the word on a women form, female form, and not only on the men form. So I see that there is, maybe Olga Papadopoulou wants the floor to express her comment. Please download the presentation so that we have visual contact with everybody. Thank you very much. So I've just seen that Olga Papadopoulou, please, Olga, try to express your comment about the triple disadvantage. Yes.
Yeah, first of all, congratulations for the presentation and for the organization of the event. Do you hear me?
Yes, very well.
Okay.
Tell us about you. You are a student at Panteion or what?
No, I'm not a student. First of all, let me introduce myself a bit. And I'm hold a PhD in economic geography with a focus on labor market inequalities and labor market. Currently, I work in Hellenic Manpower Employment Organization So I work in the public sector of Greece. And my question or my note was that women face double disadvantages or triple disadvantages. There's not a question, just a point, a focus point, that is not only one disadvantage, but many. Being a woman, being a scientist, and have a migrant background, so means that there's no one-way disadvantage.
Okay,
I
thank
don't
you.
know if Sofia or other researchers have also mentioned that.
You mean the migrant background that you mentioned, yes?
Yes, let's say that if we have a woman here in Greece, it's a scientist and also is of African origin.
Yes, okay.
So this makes the things more difficult for her to have a high productivity or productivity or labor productivity in her research, let's say.
Okay, thank you. If let's say if Sofia wants to say something about
But I see the perspective from the overall labor productivity and also the position of women in the labor market, just not being only scientists, but with the label of worker.
Yes, okay, but it work anyway, labor market, both science and not science is labor market anyway. Okay, so Sofia, do you want to say anything or we go to next?
I can say that it's a very interesting question, and to bring intersectionality into this analysis. I haven't done it because it's already, I think I have already stuffed way too much into my presentation, but that is a dimension that is central to feminist studies. I know there's a whole stream of literature on foreign women in academia, for example. That investigates the this extra layer of, well, often disadvantage that they face. And I think as the science community gets more and more international, that's absolutely an aspect that should be central to the investigation of gender in academia, but also in science careers.
Sofia, may I?
Thank you.
I have another question for you. How you explain or you try to study the wage differentials between women and men in academia? Do you still do you research this or not?
Yes, I research gender inequality in academia. Yes, along with Siri.
Yes, but also in terms of earnings, of wages.
I have studied recruitment, mostly recruitment decisions.
Recruitment, okay.
Yes, multiple methodologies, multiple perspectives.
Yeah, I also agree with the intersections
sorry,
between...
Sorry, it's okay. I give the floor now to somebody else, Rafaela Betta, for instance. Olga, sorry, I think you had, you wanted to make any extra question or it's okay?
It's okay, Professor Stratigaki. Thank you very much once again. It was very enlightening.
Okay, thank you. So I give the floor to Rafaela Betta. Vita, how you?
Betta.
Betta, okay, correct.
Your talk was very inspiring. I only joined, I think, halfway through, right before the productivity measurements. And I wanted to ask, is that measurement, the publications, is it accurate or reflecting the actual contribution of women to publications? Because publications can take a while to publish, so the data might not be representative of the actual body of publications that should, I don't know how to say it, that are going to be from women, but due to time delays or which have the pandemic has actually affected publication times and response periods and all that. So maybe I think I'm not sure how you actually saw that, but I think it could not reflect the actual data, and I hope it doesn't. Also, on the point Olga made, that women actually are, about the interrupted worker, that women actually are, I'm sorry, I didn't introduce myself. I am a PhD student at the University of Thessaly. I'm doing my PhD in biochemistry. And it's a very harsh field to how to combine family too. And sometimes women, especially women, actually, everyone has the grant proposal race, actually, that is a race. And women actually fear more because pregnancy and maternity leave might actually translate into loss of gaps in your resume, so you don't get the same points as people who didn't get pregnant, men and women. So maternity leaves and pregnancies can actually cost you positions and grants. And I think that I don't think that it will actually ever be equal to men or people that don't have children. Thank you very much.
Thank you for your question. Sofia?
Maybe this was more of a comment rather than a question. I mean, it's certainly a very interesting comment, but maybe it was more than a comment, since it was
yes.
Yeah, it was pretty much in the same line of what I said, that the limits of quantification or attempts to quantify, and how it doesn't reflect a number of parameters. So that's yeah, very good point.
Okay, thank you very much. And me being also the chair of the Greek Association of Women in Universities, I appreciated this comment because it is sometimes we think that in academia there are no big gaps because we are, let's say, all in the upper level of professional hierarchy, but this is not true. Sometimes we find out that there are a lot of lacks of even legislation for normal things like motherhood or paternal leave and so on. Okay, so there is a discussion in the chat about the Greek word for scientist. But I'm sorry for our colleagues who have raised this, but we cannot put it in together with Sofia now, because it is in Greek, absolutely Greek, about the type of word that we have to use.
Still, I think it is very interesting. If you gave the test to Greek children, since there is only a male word for scientist, of course they are much more likely to draw a male, right? It's not English.
Right.
Yeah, so that's really something interesting, I think, because then it would be performative, so to speak.
Yes, but
the word scientist, and they of course will be more likely to draw a man.
Maybe we have to invent it, but then it is quantity that imposes it in our language. We know that we have to use the new words for a lot of things. So why not also to use if there are a lot of. So Nelly Kaburi, please.
Mr. Stratigakis, there's also a question
Yes.
before Nelly.
Yes.
If you excuse me, it was from Sofia Moratti.
Yes.
She wrote on the chat that she would like to make a comment.
Okay, I missed it. Sorry. Yes. Okay, we give her the floor. Yes, Sofia.
Hello to everyone. That must be
Nefeli
me.
Mitiu. Okay, sorry.
Yes.
Sorry for that. I tried to
No
check
problem.
the chat, and it's very full. Okay. Yes, please.
So now the conversation has kind of drifted away, but I just wanted to make a comment about something that Ms. Olga said about immigrant women and scientists, that I find it very interesting. I now volunteer for an NGO, which is a community center for women. It's in Samos, and I got to meet many women that are actually refugees, and they're also scientists. So I was having this conversation with a lady from Uganda. She studied in the University of Uganda Science, but we had a long conversation, and she's really educated, and as I see it, her in the hierarchy, her role as a refugee in the world goes above her being a scientist. So she's never going to put all her knowledge in science into work just because she's a refugee. So as we see right now in other occasions all over the world right now, being an immigrant it's like a disadvantage. So maybe sometimes you're never going to use your knowledge in science just because you're either an immigrant or a refugee. And this is just a comment I wanted to make about the scientists coming from other countries. That's it.
Thank you, Nefeli Mitsiou. Thank you very much.
You're very welcome.
I just want to add to your question also the experience of the previous wave of migrants to Greece, the economic migrants of the 90s. And you know very well that there are thousands of women from the ex-East European countries coming to Greece for domestic labor and care work. And they were scientists that they had never had the opportunity to work in what they have studied. So this was really migration is very, very often connected to
progress.
This lack of possibility. So Sofia, do you want to say anything, or we go to Nelly? Okay. Yes.
Yes, I agree with that. Of course, again, in an intersectional perspective, it would be more important to give serious spaces to neglected knowledges, and to including people who have been trained into a profession but do not get the chance because of kind of circumstances such as migration, particularly in a situation of a global crisis. They never get the chance to work in the field they are trained for. That's a huge social problem.
Yes. Okay. Nelly, please take the floor.
Oh, sorry. Thank you, Sofia, for this talk. It was very, very interesting. And it resonates with a lot of things that are happening in Greece. And this, I think, is rather interesting because in Greece, we have very weak structures for the care of children and the elderly. And the state does not provide in the same way that it provides in Norway. And I think this is a much neglected aspect of the discussion of gender in the Greek academia, how the lack of public support for care impacts on the careers of female academics. In other words, what I'm trying to say is that many things that for women in other countries seem to be something that they experienced during the pandemic, for us, it's something that we've always experienced when we have children or when we have elderly to take care of. So this is a huge problem. I mean, it is something I have done research in the past on women in science, and I found that it was extremely difficult in Greece for women to combine scientific careers, especially when this involved going to labs and doing experiments. It was extremely difficult to do that while having children, because there is no public support for care. So, and I think it's not just Greece. I mean, these are global inequalities in terms of welfare systems that impact also on the, let's say, on the global rates of participation in academia, because it is almost, I mean, if you don't have public support, and in the case of Greek scientists, it's always someone you have to pay to take care of the children. then it's also a question of class, because maybe you don't have the money to pay someone to support your children. So I think that the other thing that we find when we look at, for example, at C figures, which is the European measurements of gender equality in academia, is that, you know, these kinds of care structures, public care structures, play a very important role. And so what I wanted to ask you, if because as I said, I think that in Greece, the changes that occurred with the pandemic are important, but are not as important as in other countries. So I wanted to ask you if you have an idea of to what extent, I mean, I know that in Norway, daycare centers were open during the pandemic, or not, for at least for some parts. If you have an idea of a more, you know, of differences among based on class, and differences based on access to care in different areas of Norway. Thank you.
Daycares and schools were open in some areas in Norway. There were the closure depended on the infection rate. Okay, so specific decisions were made at the local level. Still now, when one pupil is even asymptomatic, even if it does not have symptoms, but the child is tested and turns out to be infected with coronavirus, then the whole class is kept at home. And so there is a lot of attention in Norway on not spreading the virus, but maybe because of this extra attention, it didn't spread to the extent that it did in other countries. Okay, so it is true that schools, and especially for little children, elementary schools and daycares were open most of the time. Yeah, I have a daughter, for example, and her school was closed for like 3 weeks, and after which, in the beginning of the pandemic, so around March last year, I believe, and then it stayed always open. So you can say the parents could be very reliant on the school being open, and the school in Norway also includes an after school until 4 o'clock for little children until the 4th year of elementary school. So yeah, it was better than it has been. I know, for example, that in Italy, the schools have been closed for months, and in some areas, this has costed the job to a lot of people. They simply didn't have someone, unless they had grandparents they could rely on. So that is very much a situation in Southern European countries, that the public child care system tends to be a sort of minimal safety net, but it's actually your family that you can count on, and you only when the family's capacity to care is exhausted, then you have to look for other solutions. You know, that's pretty much the assumption. So when it comes to the impact on Norwegian workers, I'm sure it was much less than it was in Southern Europe. I don't have the details with me. I know that there was recently a report was issued on work condition in the public sector under the pandemic. So we hope to get someone to discuss specifically that report with all the details for the panel that will follow this lecture. But if your general observation that the situation has been better in Norway is founded, because I know from direct experiences also in other countries, and especially in Southern European countries, that people have lost jobs because no one would take care of the children, and there was no service in place, no reliable service in place.
Thank you.
Thank you, Sofia. Now I give the floor to Vasiliki Kandzara, a colleague of mine in Panteion University on gender and education. Vaso, could you express what you write in the chat orally?
Yes,
So that
okay.
Please, Vaso, yes.
Thank you very much, Maria. Thank you, Sofia, for the very interesting lecture. I was 10 minutes late, but you had started already. I thought academic quarter was also in Norway. Something. but I was late because I had to put my clothes, I have to do the laundry to put it outside to dry. You see, the scientist has to do multitasking. Anyway, what I experienced, Maria and me are colleagues. I'm working at the University of Panteion, and what I see is that most of the men have multiple posts. So they run from one post to the other. They are never there. They don't do the job.
Do you mean multiple jobs?
But they got promotion.
They have multiple jobs. Is that what you mean by posts? Multiple.
They have other kinds of posts. Some of them research related, or coordinating board somewhere, or being part of the in organizations, be a director or something. So what I'm trying to say, this is not most of the way. I don't think the issue is that women have to mother or have to do other things, but the issue is how this is used to exclude them.
Yeah.
So there are some hidden mechanisms. And sorry, I was not in the beginning. Maybe you mentioned it. So
no, it's okay. Very, very good point.
My question is not to whether you plan to do some kind of research in this hidden mechanism, because there is a lot of give and take between academics and deals that you don't see it. And when, for example, you see a person having too many publications, you say, oh, they're not good. If a person has few publications, you say, oh, the person does not have many publications. So you use the number of publications to exclude or to include. So it's very.
It depends on depending if they are women and men, and you are
exactly.
right, Eva. So I think you are right. I mean, childcare is for me, that I don't have children anyways, really less important than all the rest of the mechanisms that are structuring things and hierarchies, hidden, as you write, exactly, hidden hierarchies for creating, let's say, this devaluation of women's scientists' work and over-evaluation of men's. So I think it's a very good point.
One last thing, Maria, because I think people need maybe to hear it, that I've heard personally saying it's a man, he needs to have an income. You see? And this is where cultural representations come in, Sofia. Thank you very much for
maybe there is Rafaela Beta who wants to comment on it, and then Sofia responds, and then okay, please Rafaela Beta,
thank you very much.
If you want to add something. Yes.
Well, the point Professor Canzara made was very spot on. What I would like to comment though is that nowadays I've seen more and more conferences, for example, that have taken into account childcare for mothers that want to attend, for example, a conference that's taking over more than 2 days, for example, and they actually provide childcare options. And I've seen in my profession, biomedical sciences, for example, that some institutions offer either a discount or free childcare options within the institution the mother's working at, which I think is a great relief of stress for the person, taking care of the child, as well as that. I've heard, for example, I didn't think of it as negative, but in Germany, in a laboratory, they had the common room that they used as a kitchen to park their kids there so that they could play with each other, which I think is a step forward. But again, it's not proper childcare if it's in a laboratory. And I think that there have been some excellent steps forward. But again, this stereotypical sense that women actually do have to care for children is the one that keeps women and discriminates women from positions and career development. Thank you again.
Thank you, Rafaela. So, Sofia, you want to comment on this?
No, very interesting. But again, I think they were mostly comments and very interesting ones.
Okay. So I didn't understand about this hidden mechanism and how things work. Do you have any study about it or what?
Yeah, well, what I mentioned at the beginning, the paradox of meritocracy in organization.
Yeah.
In science organizations, I mean, when meritocracy is a very important part of the so-called corporate philosophy, and that can also be the case in academia in some sense, and the metricization and the counting and the quantification can contribute.
All these are mechanisms.
Build that image, you know, that it's a measure, it's counting, therefore it's objective. It's counting, therefore it's unbiased. And then we experience that, as your colleague rightly said, the number of where the papers are published doesn't count so much, and that it's used differently depending on who the author is. So much for the objectivity. So it's very interesting that when meritocracy is strongly invoked as a justification for decisions, there is evidence that decisions end up being even more biased, particularly biased. This is a study of 2010. It's one of the first slides I discussed. I find it very original.
Thank you, Sofia. This brings me to my point about to my question to you, or to if you have some information to add from the Norwegian point of view. We have, let's say, learned from the European Union mostly, not from Greek experience that does not exist, but we have learned that there are policies to make in order to counter balance, let's say, this phenomena. So the European Union has developed since 20 years now policies on the slogan was women research, or research by women, for women, on women. So this is first, I mean, the question of quota. Okay, how many women you promote, how many women you finance, you fund with projects and so on. I make a small parenthesis here. Nobody knows, very few people know that in Greece there was, at a certain point, there was a quota on research councils and on research, let's say, all research bodies, about 1/3 of women. And this law has never been implemented, not even once. Okay, it exists, maybe it exists, but nobody knows. It's really at the drawers of the bureaucracy, of the administration. So anyway, the question of quota, I mean, what is quota? And I know that, that there are some questions. I mean, it interests also in the Norwegian science foundations, the first one. The second is gender in research. That means how gender is in research, the second component of this tri slogan. And four is for women. That means if the research is has an objective of gender equality. So all these three in the European Union, as we know, since 20 years, they are building up on this 40%, 50% on evaluation panels, on funding proposals, and all these things. They are building on it. And now the latest thing that they had agreed is to for all kind of funding by the European Union, all kind of funding in research, the research institution or university who is going to apply has to have a gender equality plan in the institution before they apply, so as a prerequisite. And I think this is very, very good. And if Eleni Apospori is here, a colleague of mine from another university who developed such a plan, would, if she is still here, please, I will give her the floor afterwards. But to tell us about that
issue.
So there are several levels of policy making, in make it brief, on all these aspects. And I think this is very, very important, because okay, analysis is great, but we need also to have some measures to counterbalance, not completely counter, but at least reduce the gaps. So what is the experience in Norway about all these things? If you want to tell us, And I think this will be, let's say, the final.
I think it is very interesting this that you are raising, and particularly the question that I find most interesting is the gap between regulation and practice. I mean, you can have all the regulation that you want, but there can be so much resistance against implementing them that they may end up being black ink on white paper, quite literally. And there is also evidence that the more bodies are involved in the implementation, and the less likely the rule is to be implemented. But generally, Norway has a great deal of experience with installing gender equality in academia, with quotas in general, also outside of academia in the world of business. In 1983, a 40% quota was introduced on the corporate boards of state-owned companies. Already in 1983, 40% for women. And 20 years later, 40% for each gender. So this time it was formulated in gender-neutral language. Also in the boards of publicly listed private corporations. So very strong state regulation of private business that did not really encounter very big problems in implementation, even though it was controversial. Also nationally was discussed, but they didn't have the huge problems in implementation that would have been the case, as it would have been the case, I think, in most of the countries in the world. And also a similar approach of being concerned with gender equality and attempts to promote gender equality from above also happened in academia. In the 1990s, late 1990s, they created earmarked chair for women, meaning that the chair professorial chair were given through open competition, but only women were allowed to apply. So this earmarked chairs. But then the European Free Trade Association Court struck that down, and also something similar happened in Sweden with the European Court. Okay, so Norway was violating the free trade agreement, and the competition when it get okay. Like, I see you perfectly get what I am saying, but that is a tension between radical approaches to gender equality at the national level and more liberal approaches at the supranational level. Okay, so this is more an ideological tension than a legal one, I would say. So no more earmarked chairs in Norway, but there have been plenty of other things done, such as gender equality plans, such as quotas for women. When qualifications are equal, you have to prefer the candidate of the underrepresented gender, that kind. So a million ways in which the Norwegian government has shown that and many Norwegian higher education institutions have shown that they are very serious about promoting gender equality. That doesn't mean that it's perfect. You know, there is more that can be done, and women are historically disadvantaged as a gender everywhere, including Norway. There is no such thing of perfect gender equality paradise anywhere yet.
This we know very well. Although Greece is at the bottom of the classification of index of European index of 27 countries, so we are at the bottom. But still, we know that also in the upper cases, things are not so perfect. About this earmark professor positions, I think that it was not promoted. It was not. They didn't succeed to justify as a positive measure, because if it was a positive measure, the European treaty permits positive measures in favor of the represented sex. But maybe this type of measure to earmark one position.
They have a liberal approach, as I said, and not a radical approach. So countries that try to champion a radical approach, then their measures, their legislation then gets struck down by international regulation, clashes against international regulation. Actually, there has been a discussion also recently in Norway about the so-called study points that the Norwegian government and some higher education institutions have introduced for example, boys who want to be I think in psychology, and girls who want to go into the traditionally male-dominated sector. So the idea is that you have a more uniform student body by helping, so to speak, students of the underrepresented gender. And that has been a big debate too, not so much a political debate, but whether it was legal, whether it was.
Yes, but that's why I say that legally, I speak about legal.
Even within
the
Norway,
European Union permits the positive measure. This is what and the Greek constitution also since 2001. But you have to argue that this is a positive measure in favor of the underrepresented sex, and this is permitted both in the European Union and the Greek constitution.
What's interesting is that even within Norway, there were different voices in the legal community about whether the study points were permissible or not, whether they clashed against European legislation or not.
Yeah, good. Thank you. So there is somebody who wants to take the floor. It's Irini Tiklu, please.
Ναι, καλησπέρα σας. Hello.
Hello, Irini.
I'm Irini. I'm a teacher. I work on a private school, and I'm I admire Norway's educational system. I began to learn about Scandinavian educational system during my master's. So I would love if some best practices from many that you have would actually could be, we could πώς είναι, να γίνουν στην Ελλάδα.
To transfer or good examples, as we say, good examples to bring them in Greece from Norway.
Yes. And now I want to have a comment about gender stereotypes in the Greek educational books. Even though we have new books, there are still transfer gender and role stereotypes. For example, there are problems in math that are saying, for example, that a woman gets salaries, for example, 1,000 euros a month, but her husband takes 1,000, and 1,500. And so I always, when I get to that problem, I always say to my female students that, okay, you don't believe that. If you want to make more money than your husband, you can, of course you can. And also there is a stereotype in many math problems and in grammar books that are saying that a woman cooker does that, not a male cooker, a woman that is καθαρίστρια, πώς είναι?
Cleaning lady.
Cleaning lady or caretaker, and that's the new books in Greece, not the older. The older were very worse. So stereotypes are still existing in Greek books and in Greek teacher mind. And I'm working about 16 years now, and every day I try to break down one of my stereotypes and be very, very careful, because I have been born in this community, and some things, you know, you think over them, and you think that you don't have stereotypes, but there are something like a part of your body. So every day I think that I try not to have stereotypes. And also there is one stereotype I want to change. I teach on the 5th and the 6th grade. I like I like very much children that are 10 to 12 years old. And so, for example, my students, my female students, are very low and get stressful when they want to talk to me about anything in the classroom. I mean, in the classroom, not outside, on private matter. So I try to reinforce them, but it's very difficult. So I used to tell them that I was like them, when I was a very shy child. And I think that women in Greece are also shy because in the university, during my two masters, during many seminars that I have been taken, I was very shy to speak up, and especially when I was with many seminars that there are teachers like me, and most of us are women in Greece. I mean, about 75% we are women and only 25 men. I saw that all men were raised their hand and wanted to say something, but women were shy. And I got mad, and now I have changed that. And that's why that's the thing that I say to my female students, that okay, from your own pace, you get started and don't be shy and speak up, and one pace at a time. And then I told my male students that, okay, you know, because women are not talking till the age of 30 to 35, maybe 40, then you must be patient, because at the age of 35 to 40, women are starting to shout and want to say everything that they kept for so long. So you must be patient. Okay.
Thank you.
And that's my question. I've got
Sorry? There is a question. Okay.
I've got a question. So maybe there is research that must be taking place about how many headmistresses, women, I mean, there are in Greek, even though there are too many teachers, women teachers, but I think there are a very little number of them that are headmistresses.
Okay, thank you very much for sharing your experience. We cannot reply to you about Greece now in numbers. We are not ready to do that, but we could through email we could find the figure and let you know. So I would like the last speaker for today. I give the floor to Eleni Apospori, a colleague of mine in Athens Economic University, who has a comment, but also Eleni, please tell us. You have to leave now. Okay, are you here, Eleni? No. Okay, so Eleni left. Sorry. Because she runs this project for developing a gender equality plan in the Economic University. That's why I thought she would be interesting to give her the floor, but unfortunately she has to leave. Okay, so I think we are coming to an end. I will give, I will give the floor to Sofia for a last comment, and then I will give you some practical information about our future events in this ProGender. Please, Sofia, you want to?
So my last comment would be
close. How many? Lot of you have really produced a lot of questions and discussions, so your talk was very good.
My last remark would be a big thank you, really. So to you and to the organizers of this workshop, and to Tomás and Nelly and Siri, who introduced me, and the ambassador, who unfortunately had to leave, and all the people who attended today for such a very interesting discussion. And it was a pleasure to talk to you.
Thank you very much. It was a pleasure to listen to you, and I know you will be close to the ProGender project also for the future, and we are very happy for that. We have at least 1 year more to run, and this is what I want to, this will be the last information today, that we keep on organizing lectures. Don't forget that we have 2 more topics to deal with, gender and the communities, and also gender and governance. So there are topics that are not very usual treated, at least through the pandemic. We had much more information and much more talks about gender-based violence, care, and so on. So science, governance, communities is something more original, and I hope we will have you all with us. Our next event is an online discussion, panel discussion on gender and science, the lecture and then the panel discussion in 2 weeks' time. So please follow us in the Facebook to know all the information about the project, and we wait everybody to be with us again in our next event that is on 26th of April at 4 o'clock on a discussion panel on gender and science with 2 participants from Norway, 2 participants from Iceland, and 2 participants from Greece. So we have a balanced panel, and hope to see you all again. Thank you very much for being with us all this time. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Goodbye.
Bye-bye. Thank you very much.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.